Welcome to a discussion with the Writers' Circle of Durham Region on the changing landscape in the publishing industry. Once upon a time, a writer was expected to do nothing more than dress in black, sit in a garret, drink and smoke too much, and eventually toss completed manuscript pages out the window into the waiting arms of an agent, who would then whisk those pages off to an eager publisher. This would, of course, be followed by a juicy advance, all sorts of attention lavished on the development of the book, not to mention a sizable marketing budget. This is a fairy tale, of course, never more so than in today's world. As technology becomes an ever more integral part of publishing, the author's role is changing and lines are blurring between traditional practices in the larger mainstream houses and the new creativity of small independent presses. Today we're discussing these changes and what they mean for writers. With us are two active and distinguished members of the literary community in Durham. Erin Thomas is an emerging children's writer. Her first novel, Draco's Fire, was published in September 2009 as part of a high-low fantasy series from HIP Books. Her second, Border Patrol, also aimed at reluctant readers, will be available from Orca Sports in May 2010. James Dewar teaches advanced creative writing at Durham College and is the publisher, James, and editor of Pecan Press. He is also a poet. I thought we should start by maybe going back before things changed, not quite to the time of the fairy tale, but maybe 10 years back. James, could you give us an idea of what the publishing landscape was like at that time, both traditionally and what was going on in the alternative presses?
Well, 10 years ago, I just drank a lot, typed a lot, and tossed the manuscripts to my agent. And so that part of the story is true, except that I didn't have an agent. And they didn't go anywhere. But I would say that 10 years ago, boy, the industry has changed a lot in 10 years. The big publishing houses had bigger budgets. They were sending writers on book tours. They had budgets for promoting the new books that came out. I just gone blank.
What was the alternative press scene like? In those days, self-publishing was not something that people talked about. They weren't proud of saying, I've published a book, and they weren't publishing the quality that they are now. So what was that scene like? Was it? Well,
the only scene that was self-publishing that really had a lot of respect was the poetry chapbook scene. People like Stuart Ross started that back in the late 70s, early 80s. And it became quite common for poets as a way of getting their poetry out into the hands of the public and to develop a name for themselves, to publish their own little chapbooks of their poems and either just give them away or sell them for a small amount of money as a form of getting the art out there. And that form of self-publishing actually had a fair amount of respect, not just on the street, but from the actual poetry community itself.
I'm sorry, that was in the 80s, as I recall, that Stuart was doing that, the very early 80s.
Yes.
And he was literally standing on the street, right, with photocopied pieces of paper.
Yes, photocopied, and he would try and sell them. And I remember him saying once that he was surprised he never got slapped or kicked or punched, because he couldn't believe he didn't think people would buy them, but they did. And if you know Stuart, it's because he probably followed them down the street with the poem and said, "Buy it, it's only a nickel."
Yeah.
But on the other hand, excuse me, you had the vanity presses that were starting up, or not starting up, they've been around a long time. And the whole idea of you publishing yourself just didn't exist in terms of having any kind of reputation, or people would consider what you were publishing was of the same quality.
So there was no credibility in
No, not very much. There was some self-publishing going on in the nonfiction field. For instance, Nick Boothman started out by self-publishing his own book, How to Get People to Love You in 90 Seconds or Less, and ended up selling that to a much larger publishing house. So there were people who were able to do the self-publishing route, but not very many that did very well at it. And I can't think of any novelists that really did a good job of it.
Bigger in nonfiction.
Yes, nonfiction and poetry are about the only place you would find self-publishing that had any kind of respect in the community.
So let's talk a little bit about the vanity presses then, because they would have been one of the major alternatives in self-publishing then. They aren't any longer, and we'll get to that. But at the time, Erin, do you want to just comment on what you've probably experienced or come across in terms of various types of publishers, and that being one of them?
I've chosen to go the traditional route. I've heard that any situation where you have to pay money to have your book published is considered a vanity press, because you're paying money to put your product out there. And as far as I'm concerned or have heard, the reputation there is still very poor, that people feel that there's no gatekeeper, there isn't the same kind of quality control, and it's, I guess the technology has made it easier and easier to self-publish, which is good in a way, because people that maybe wouldn't have had a chance to get their quality work out there are going to have it, because I know the publishing process traditionally is very, very slow. But the trouble is that there's just so much stuff out there now, and a lot of it isn't
much
going
stuff
to be the
meaning
same
published
quality.
work?
So much self-published book, because it's becoming easier and easier to create a book and put your name on it and say, look, I wrote a book.
Is that a problem? Is that a problem?
I think in a way it is, actually. It's all right as long as you're going to, I guess, go through the same steps that a publisher would go through. You need a strong editorial. I know that you feel strongly about that, James. And again, I don't know much about pre-production and layout and that, but I know there are standards for that, and people who know about it can look at it and say, this is good cover design, this is poor cover design. I would never design my own cover because I know that I'm ignorant in that area.
Right.
But if the presses aside that take advantage of people by asking for a ridiculous amount of money up front and promising things that aren't delivered is different than paying a supported self-publisher who will help you through the process and give you editorial and give you layout and give you some marketing suggestions.
And I think that's a different situation
That's a
than
whole
a vanity
different
press.
situation,
That's not the same thing.
But that's fairly recent development in the field, though. I have published a fair number of chapbooks for poets who have paid me to publish their books, and I always provided the editing for the book. And that was just, I just did it because I wanted to do it. And but after I did about 10 of them, I realized how much of my life I was spending editing other people's work for nothing.
Huge job.
And I decided that if I was, and the expectations of people were that they would just deliver you their work, and then you would put it in the book, and you would get it printed for them, and you would deliver them a couple hundred books for whatever the price was that you worked out with the printer, and then they would disappear. And that's basically, you're right, that's a form of vanity publishing, but because you want your own work out there. But I think it doesn't have the same weight. The word vanity publishing doesn't have the same weight to me as it used to, because now whenever someone comes to me and asks to do a book, I say, I'll do your book on the condition that either I or someone I respect edits it. You have a book cover, you either provide it, or you get it done by someone that is not your 4-year-old son, and you get editorial work. I already said that, and layout, and you end up with a book that's going to look very professional, as if it was done by a big house, because people aren't going to buy a book that doesn't look like it was done by a big house these days. They're the cheap staple together copies just aren't. People aren't going to buy them anymore.
So that's a major change in the past
Yes,
10 years.
it is.
That Vanity Press it's fallen off into its own little universe, and it's dropped, and people know that now. And self-publishing has risen to something that it can be an art form if you want to.
Well, there's been quite a. Let's face it. There was a. And we think of the worst case of a vanity press. We're talking about someone that you say, I want you to publish, Mike. Would you publish? You send them in a chapter of your novel, and they say, oh, this is the most fantastic thing I've ever seen. We'll publish 1,000 copies for only $10,000.
We'll probably come back to this point, I think, later in the discussion. We'll leave it there for now, and return with maybe some conversation on agents and.
Sure. Love to.